Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss the Open Skies Treaty, which the United States has said it will be walking away from, and it's blamed Russia in that case. Now, the Open Skies Treaty itself came into force in 2002, is designed to boost confidence, lessen mistrust between different countries vis-a-vis their respective military activities. It allows for overflights, surveillance flights, and in some ways, really over each other's territories with short notice. And there are around 35 nations that are party to the treaty, including the Russians, the Canadians, and even the Brits, as well as, of course, other countries. So at this point in time, this is a bit of a trend, isn't it, when it comes to Donald Trump and how he's acted towards different treaties that the United States is a part of. And there's a long list that we can possibly lay out. What does this say about the U.S. role going forward vis-a-vis trust with other nations? Because that's what treaties are, right? They increase trust with other nations. They increase mutual interests, et cetera, with other nations around the world, ensuring that each other's interests are protected at the same time, as well as, of course, their national securities. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Mark Sleboda, who is an international affairs and security analyst. He's a senior lecturer in international relations and security studies. He's also a U.S. Navy vet. He's joining us now from Moscow. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Jim Williams, who's a 7-time Emmy Award-winning journalist. He's the Washington bureau chief for LJC Media and Genesis Communications. And joining us from Perm in Russia is Pavel Luzin, who is a PhD in international relations. He's an expert in Russia's foreign policy and defense. Pavel, Jim, and Mark, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Mark, what do you make of Donald Trump walking away from this treaty? As I said in my introduction, he has blamed Russia for this.
Yes, this is just the latest treaty that the U.S. has pulled out of unilaterally, including almost the entirety of the Cold War era nuclear architecture of arms control, and that started not with Trump, but way back in the early 2000s with George W. Bush pulling out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, and then the U.S. erecting anti-ballistic missile defense stations across Europe. This is continued with Trump, his unilateral withdrawal from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, as well as pulling out of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, treaties with Iran again and again. The Trump administration feels that the United States should not be bound by international law, that it is, in fact, above international law, and it also should not be restricted by bilateral treaties with other countries. It wants complete freedom of maneuver to pursue primacy around the world. And once again, like pulling out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, this has nothing to do with Russia. The U.S. accusations about Russian violations of the treaty have been rejected from Europe's own leaders and from U.S. arms control experts testifying before Congress. This is all about the U.S. pivoting to what it views as an inevitable war for hegemony over the Pacific with China. And this is all about China.
Pavel, tell us, what do you make of the Russian role in all of this, if there is any, and how does this then affect Russia at this time?
So, first of all, I'm not sure that Russian violations of this treaty, if these violations took place, that these violations were significant enough for the treaty. I think that Trump wants to withdraw from the treaty by American domestic reasons. And by American foreign policy reasons. I mean that currently American technical intelligence and satellite intelligence is so advanced that Americans just don't need on aircrafts, reconnaissance aircrafts for this purpose. I mean, for the strategic reconnaissance. Towards foreign policy, as my colleague previously told, that it is all about China. Towards Russian prospect, the Open Sky Treaty is very important for Russia because this treaty allows Russia to balance Russian weaknesses in satellite intelligence. because we don't have enough space capabilities, space reconnaissance capabilities, space intelligence capabilities, and we use aircraft flights according to this Open Sky Treaty to analyze as American military advancements as European military advancements.
Yeah.
So as I can imagine, this American withdrawal from the treaty is very painful for Russia.
Mark, let me go to you. What then happens vis-a-vis trust between these nations, right? Because even if the Russians and the Americans haven't gotten along for many, many years, and there have been disagreements on a wide range of issues, they've always seemingly made it work behind the scenes, right, when it comes to these treaties and otherwise. Do you think all of that is now in jeopardy?
Yeah, and that's quite intentional. The U.S. doesn't need or want or desire the trust of Russia or China. I mean, even going back to such basic documents as the U.S. new national security strategy, the U.S. has pivoted high gear into a mind frame of great power competition with Russia and China. And pulling out of the Open Skies Treaty is really just a prelude to not renewing the New START treaty, which expires next year, and that's the last and the big granddaddy of all Cold War arms control architecture. It's the one that limits the number and of missiles and warheads on both sides between the U.S. and Russia. The U.S. wants that gone, and with Open Skies gone, there is much less ability to verify the New START treaty. So that provides another impetus for not renewing that treaty. And then we are in a full-blown global arms race with a whole new host of advanced technologies like hypersonic weapons, underwater drones, all kinds of weapons that weren't covered in the original arms control. And the U.S. Special Presidential Envoy on Arms Control, Marshall Billingsley, recently in a discussion with the Hudson Institute, he laid clear that the U.S. is fully embracing a new arms race. It has said that we know how to win these races. We know how to spend our adversaries into oblivion. All right, that's the quotes. That's where the U.S. is heading. That is the mind frame that they are dealing with. They view China as a greater threat than Russia, but realize that their actions have pushed the two of them together, and they are preparing for the next war.
Well, I wonder, do you think that this necessarily means that this entire treaty will fall apart, or do you think the treaty will just automatically sort of just wither away? Because there are so many other nations that are part of this treaty. So it's not like it was just the Russians and the Americans, right? As I said in my introduction, 35 nations in total are part of this treaty.
So hopefully that we will have an opportunity to keep this treaty in force, even without the United States. Because, as I told you previously, this treaty is very important for Russia, not only in political aspects, but also in technical aspects, because we use these aircrafts, reconnaissance aircrafts, instead of using space reconnaissance, because we don't have enough capabilities for space reconnaissance. But also, I see there is an opportunity for some paradoxical consequence of this American withdrawal, because currently Russia and Europeans, they are members of this treaty, and Russia, maybe in future, may use this treaty as a starting point for security talks with Europeans, but without Americans. Maybe we will see this. At least we may see the attempt of Moscow to realize this opportunity. I'm not sure, of course.
Before I let you go, Mark, I wanted to get your final thoughts. Do you think that at this point in time, when we're looking at these sort of treaties, are we necessarily heading for a war, or is just an arms race for the sake of that?
Just real quickly, I disagree with Pavel there. Russia should pull out of this treaty if the U.S. pulls out of it. The U.S. already did more than 3 times as many overflights over Russia with this treaty as the U.S. was allowed to do, Russia was allowed to do over the U.S. And we know that U.S.'s European NATO allies will automatically share their intelligence from this treaty with the United States, whether or not the U.S. is a part of it. So it is to Russia's detriment to continue participating in this treaty if the U.S. pulls out of it. Yes, I do believe that this is not only heralds a new arms race, but that it heralds some type of conflict in the future. Again, this is primarily about China. And it is about the South China Sea, the Taiwan Straits. The U.S. is using their withdrawal from the INF Treaty to load up a ring of land-based intermediate range and short range ballistic missiles around China to close what they call a missile gap for what they see U.S. brass and geopolitical thinkers as an inevitable conflict off China's coast. They believe that they are trapped in a Thucydides trap, that they are a failing hegemon facing a rising hegemon. They believe that conflict is inevitable, and they are moving towards that. And this is just one more brick out of that wall.
Very well. We appreciate your time today. Viewers, we're going into our first break. We'll be back with Pavel and Jim right after that. All right, viewers, we're back and we're discussing again the Open Skies Treaty that the United States has decided to walk away from. This is a treaty which, as I said in my introduction, 35 nations are a part of. So it's not like it's just the Russians versus the Americans in this specific case, even though the U.S. has been walking away from many of those treaties that it has, with the Russians included in many of those treaties, some just bilateral treaties, other multilateral treaties, about various forms of arms controls. Let's discuss this further. We're back with Pavel and Jim. Jim, tell us what your thoughts are about why Donald Trump has decided at this point to walk away from this treaty. Is this all, as our other guests have mentioned, possibly looking towards having a freer hand to stand up, quote unquote, against China?
I don't think so, no. I think this is more of a situation where we're talking about President Trump's kind of on-brand situation of not liking any treaty that the United States has entered, going back to the Bush administration all the way through the Obama administration. I mean, he's gotten out of everything from the Paris Climate Accord to most recently the Open Skies. But I don't think it's in some regards to play to his base to say, well, I'm tough on Russia, when in fact it doesn't hurt or in any way, shape, or form does it include Russia. I think that's kind of the paper tiger here.
But nevertheless, Jim, it has an impact, right? The Russians obviously would view this negatively. It doesn't do any favors for the U.S. in regards to its image around the world too, because treaties are, at their very definition, they increase trust between nations.
You're 100% correct. I agree with you. It doesn't help the United States by getting out of these treaties. It doesn't help the United States by threatening the World Health Organization that we're going to pull out of there, or NATO that we're going to cut back our spending. So no, you're 100% correct. This, if anything, weakens the United States in its on a global basis. So no, I agree with you 100% on that.
All right, so Pavel, when we're talking about what happens next, what do you think will happen next? Do you think that we will now enter into a an escalation period of an arms race of some sort between the Russians, Americans, and even others at this point? And then what does that then mean? As I put to Mark earlier in the first segment, does this necessarily mean we are heading for a war at some point in the future?
Towards war, I prefer not to speak in these terms. I prefer to speak on political consequences near term, maybe. And I'm afraid that in coming months, in February 2021, we will see a collapse of New START, new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty that was signed in 2010 between the United States and Russia. And without any treaty in strategic arms, we may see the collapse of possible collapse of nuclear proliferation treaty and maybe a space treaty. And so the prospect is not so bright, it's not so funny. But I still hope that Moscow and Washington will be able to agree at least to prolong New START for another 5 years, and maybe not to cut off all the treaties, especially in strategic fields. I mean, nuclear fields, because of course during the last 20 years we lost missile defense treaty, we lost conventional forces in Europe treaty, we lost INF treaty. So currently we may lose open sky treaty. So it is not very good, because currently we are seeing a dismantlement of international regimes that were international arms control regimes that were created in previous 50 years.
Yeah.
More than 50 years. So it is not good prospect for all of us.
Right. Okay, so then, Jim, I think that we are then entering into a period of heightened arms race of some sort, that the U.S. will, there's so many more treaties that possibly can collapse as domino effects, right, of what's happening right now. That's a scary prospect, isn't it?
I think Pavel is 100% correct about the New START. I think that would be in danger, without question. Look, I think that we have a very unpredictable president. As far as could we enter into an arms race, that's certainly possible. Could we enter into war? I think that's less likely. I do believe this is more of a building up and President Trump's role about trying to be hard on Russia when, in some regards, not being hard on Russia. It's that yin-yang situation that has everyone in the world stage concerned about, could we go to war? Could this happen? Again, I don't think we're going to go to war, but I do agree with Pavel that the New START is definitely just one of a number of treaties that could go by the wayside, and that does open things up to an arms race again, which would be a horrible thing to have.
And then, Jim, I wonder if I may throw this into the mix, because it's interesting, isn't it, that this was the president that was actually accused of colluding, or the Russians colluded with him, essentially to bring him into office, but he's not really acting very pro-Russian right now, is he?
Well, no, and I think that part of that is to gear him up for the 2020 elections. I mean, if he looks like he's pro-Russia, like he did in 2016, well then, everybody will go, well, geez, President Trump, and Vladimir Putin are good buddies here. So I think it's kind of this is a political play to stop being considered the good cop in this role between Putin and the United States. But I think that it's a very dangerous role to play. I mean, we cannot continue to pull out of global treaties that benefit us and have benefited us for decades. So, as I said, I agree with Pavel. I think that if there were a second term of President Trump, it would definitely concern me about what he might do with the New START treaty.
I wonder, in some regards, do you think that this might bring the Russians and the Europeans closer together, right? Because there is there's that gap that already exists between the Europeans and the Americans over many issues, including, of course, the Iran nuclear deal, for example. But then I imagine because the Europeans are so much closer than Russia, they would have more of an interest in maintaining these sorts of treaties.
I think that Kremlin conducts very opportunistic foreign policy. So if when Americans will withdraw from the treaty, finally withdraw from the Open Skies Treaty, and if this treaty will continue to be in force without Americans, so Moscow may use this opportunity to establish a kind of new ground for relations with Europeans without Americans, for negotiations on European security without Americans. So it may become a kind of unpredictable consequence for Americans, I mean. Unpredictable consequence of withdrawal, because Moscow wants to divide Europeans and Americans. Moscow hates transatlantic unity, and Moscow will do everything possible to divide Brussels, Berlin, Warsaw, I don't know, and Washington. So that's what I told about. Not about that these negotiations or more closer relations with Europeans will be an inevitable prospect. But it may become an opportunity to Moscow. And currently, as I can see, currently Trump's administration does not forecast this prospect, does not analyze well all the consequences of this withdrawal.
All right. So as a final word then to you, do you think that the U.S. establishment, because, you know, certainly we know that the president has an important role when he or she, even whoever's in the office in the White House there, makes these sort of decisions. Certainly the entire establishment needs to go along with it at some level, right? Because this is about national defense. Do you think that everybody is on board with this, or do you think that they are breathing down his throat?
No, I think no, I don't think they're on board with it. I think that the Democrats in the Senate and the Democrats who run the Congress are vehemently against this. I think that you can see former Bush administration spokespeople, as well as Obama administration spokespeople who were part of the inner circle, specifically in defense, saying, no, this is not a good plan. And Pavel's right. I mean, when the United States backs out of a treaty, it opens the door, and you mentioned this as well, for Russia and China to step in and fill the void. Again, Pavel's absolutely 100% correct that these are the kind of opportunities that Russia loves to drive that wedge between the United States. So to put a point on your final question, it is that, no, I believe that the Democrats in the Senate and some Republicans in the Senate, as well as the House, are going to raise as much hell as possible to try to keep the president from leaving this deal. But at the end of the day, the president will leave Open Skies and will be able to prevail, despite the fact that he doesn't really care whether there's a lot of pressure on him from Democrats and even some on his own side to stay in the deal.
Very well. We'll leave it there at that, but we appreciate both Jim and Pavel for their time. And earlier, of course, Mark was speaking to us, too, from Moscow. They've given us, of course, the insight into what this treaty and the collapse of it, in the sense that the U.S. walking away from it, not the collapse of the entire treaty. As I said in my introduction, 35 countries total are part of it. Nevertheless, it does increase prospects for an arms race. It increased prospects for further mistrust between these nations, many of these nations with very, very lethal weapons in their arsenal. And certainly you don't want them to have any misunderstandings amongst each other or any miscalculations in any regard. We don't want to be in a less safe world. We need a world where there are controls on these sorts of arms so that not everybody is just trying to build up towards some sort of inevitable war in the future, God forbid. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss the cyber war, which is increasing seemingly between Israel and the Islamic Republic of Iran. We've had this just recently, a cyber attack by the Israelis on a port in Iran, the Shahid Raja'i port, and that caused massive, according to at least reports that came out, massive backups in the waterways around Iran vis-a-vis shipments, etc. Then there was essentially some sort of retaliation seemingly by the Iranians, according to reports again, and many Israeli websites then went down and were hacked and were replaced with a number of messages that which would be seen as threatening by the Israelis themselves. Now, this is a series of tit-for-tat sort of moves on the part of both sides against each other, and there have been accusations for many years internationally about Iran hacking other countries' sites for whatever reasons that may be outlined. But this is an interesting topic to discuss because it shows how warfare has possibly just now moved online and the kind of major real-world impact all of that can have for Iran as well at this point in time. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Farhang Jahanpour, who is a retired professor from Isfahan University. He's also a member of the Kellogg College at the University of Oxford. He's joining us now from Caversham. Farhang, thank you very much for your time today. What do you make of this sort of cyber war that's been happening? I mean, that cyber attack, I mean, and we can go back to Stuxnet as well, which affected the nuclear power within Iran. But then even this attack on the port in Iran, this is stuff which has real-world impact, doesn't it?
Well, as you know, this issue has got a really long history. It goes back a long time. In September 2015, in an article which I wrote for Interpress Service, I referred to this cyber terrorism. And I warned that this can open the Pandora's box, because even during wars, there are certain red lines that one should not cross. For example, it is said that if you deliberately attack civilian populations, it's a war crime. If you attack hospitals, it's a war crime, and so on. So I think that even in this terrible conflict between Israel and Iran, there must be some red lines that they don't cross. Of course, in the past, Israel had definitely technological superiority over Iran, and they started using this technology to paralyze Iranian nuclear activities. If you give me just 2 minutes, I'd like to refer to 3 major events which happened. The first one was the actual cyber terrorism. In 2010, Iran announced that the uranium enrichment at Natanz had been attacked, and more than 1,000 of their centrifuges had been paralyzed, had been destroyed, and had to be replaced. And it was then discovered, and it was written by New York Times and many other outlets, that it was carried out by so-called Stuxnet, which was a cyber form of warfare, which had been developed jointly by the Americans and the Israelis. They had set up dummies of Iranian installations in Israel and had tried this and eventually attacked it against the Iranian sites in Natanz. The New York Times subsequently reported that Operation Olympic Games, initiated by President George W. Bush and expanded under President Barack Obama, had been responsible for this Stuxnet. And as I said, I wrote even then that this really was a very dangerous precedent because both Israel and America are more target-rich for these kind of attacks. And if it, of course, develops between other countries, it can really paralyze various industries. Then the next one was, of course, the killing of assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists. As you know, from in 2011, 2012, Israeli agents in Iran attacked and killed a number of leading Iranian nuclear scientists, some of them actually not involved with the nuclear program. Of course, the Israeli government does not accept responsibility, but ABC News reported shortly after those attacks, and I quote, "Deadly attacks on Iranian nuclear scientists are being carried out by an Iranian dissident group," which they meant the Mujahideen al-Khalq, by an Iranian dissident group that is financed, trained, and armed by Israeli secret services. U.S. officials tell NBC News, confirming charges leveled by Iranian leaders. And US officials, speaking anonymously, said that President Obama was aware of this, but America was not involved. So that was an Israeli attack.
Yeah.
And the third one, which I just want to very briefly refer to, was the act of sabotage against military installations. Again, in November, on 12th November 2011, that's a long time ago, there was a massive explosion at Iranian military base, which killed Major General Hassan Moghaddam, the head of the Iranian missile force, and 16 members of the Revolutionary Guards. As usual, again, Israel kept silent, but Yehudi Aronot newspaper reported that some assessments indicated that the blast was the result of a military operation based on intelligence information by Israeli agents. So I think this goes a long, long way, more than 10 years ago, from up to 2010. And I think Iran has managed to now develop its cyber warfare, and it's believed to be one of the 10 top 10 countries in the world. This is a very bad precedent. It's a bad process and must be stopped by all sides.
Indeed, no, and that's a good point, isn't it? That when working about cyber warfare, I mean, to the best of my knowledge, this isn't very regulated, right? So as you had mentioned, red lines in the past wars, there would always be red lines, but it seems that we've gone past that, and there isn't really a regulatory body properly overseeing what all these countries are doing in cyberspace. And as you correctly also pointed out, there are so many targets within the US and Israel. I mean, they're really open for they're sort of ripe for being attacked in some ways, even though, of course, they have many stringent security measures in place. Do you think that the Iranians will hit back hard? I mean, nevertheless, I mean, whether we like it or not, we are now in this era. And do you think the Iranians will now play ball along those lines?
You see, American officials say it openly and officially that cyber warfare is an act of war and will be responded to very, very decisively. But somehow it seems if they or their Israeli colleagues carry out the same actions, there is no problem, and they are above the law. I think there should be a law for everybody, that like we have, in the same way we have banned many operations, for example, chemical weapons, and so on, biowarfare in wars, cyber attacks should be outlawed and should be abided by, both by America and by Israel and others. But as you pointed out, there is no mechanism, there is no organization which can police this issue and can prevent it from happening. And this is what the United Nations must seriously address before it gets too far, because otherwise it can really paralyze some major civilian operations, water resources, electricity, and so on in many countries. And of course, Western countries are much richer targets for this kind of attack.
Indeed. So then do you think that at some level, the Americans and the Israelis might regret provoking the Iranians in this regard? Because at some point, even the sanctions don't really and can't really stop Iran's countermeasures in this regard?
Well, it is human, because of course, if you are being attacked, you try to attack to defend yourselves. I mean, it can't be right that a few countries or two countries have a rule to themselves, but then everybody else is barred from it. I mean, it can't go on. What needs to be done is either cyber warfare and cyber terrorism is acceptable. In that case, all countries are entitled to engage in it. Or if it is going to be such a major threat, which it is, to the future of civilization, it should be banned, and the leading countries like America and Israel and the West generally should stop doing these kind of actions. Because, as I say, the future really can be totally chaotic. We may not fight a major war, but if you can paralyze a country's systems of electricity systems, water systems, telecommunication systems, and so on, you really have a major impact on that country. And therefore, I think it is something which must be taken seriously. And the United Nations and Security Council should take action and make sure that these sort of terrorist activities will not be continued in the future.
Very well. We'll leave there as a final word, but we do sincerely, of course, as always, appreciate your time and the insight that you bring to the conversation. There was Farhang Jahanpour speaking to us there from Caversham in the UK. We've tried to understand, viewers, a bit more about cyber warfare between the Iranians and the Israelis, and including the Americans, certainly on the Israeli side. And this has been going on for quite a while now, as Farhang there laid out those three major events that have happened regarding especially the Israeli measures against Iran, be it Stuxnet, which had huge impact on Iran's nuclear power plants, et cetera. And then we've had the nuclear scientist assassinations, which is not exactly cyber warfare, and that was more real-world consequences of that sort of cyber warfare. But now we've had these tit-for-tat measures between the Israelis and the Iranians. The Israeli measure, a lot more impactful in that it hit an Iranian port and, of course, paused and really hurt a lot of the processes in place at that port for shipments, et cetera. We'll keep a close eye on this because this can all become a lot worse, right? Even for the rest of us in the region, if these two go to war using cyberspace only. As Farhang there said, we have countries' electrical grids. We have all of the above in the firing line then. Who's to say this will not affect the rest of the countries in the region also? I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.